다들이 망어야 주체모 당 팅이버스 라비네
So today is what we could say is the second Marangok summer teachings. And so on this occasion, we are continuing to speak about the origin of the secret mantra, but of course, I'm probably not going to get to speaking about secret mantra. And I think you might be begin to wonder when I'm ever going to start speaking about the origin of the secret mantra. In any case, today what I'd like to speak about is among the different sections that I spoke about, or the different topics that I spoke about yesterday. The one that I'm going to speak about today is the communal life in the monastic community. It's changing too quickly. Sometimes technology works like that. It's better to just do this. It's better to show it like that. So daily life or communal life in the Sangha. And talk about the communal life here. And the first thing we need to speak about is about how we determine seniority. You can think about it in certain synonymous seniority. For example, in society, we often talk about this in terms of age, or talk about it a greater or lesser. And so there's this issue at a higher, lower rank. And so there's this issue in society. So if you wonder, well, how do you determine seniority and rank within the Sangha? And it's actually different in the Sangha than it is in others. It's because it depends on the earlier, later time when you took the vows. So ever you have taken the vows earlier is considered senior and more important, so you pay respects to them, and so forth. And so if you're not monastics, then you're thinking about you're taking the vows are going forth, or if you're about the novices, you'd consider the earlier ones would be considered senior, and so forth, and that gives you your position or your rank. Now, the people who take them later are considered younger and are considered lower. In particular with the bhikshus, what a bhikshu is like someone who is fully ordained. So if you talk about who has the full ordination of monastic vows, it is the bhikshus. And so the bhikshu vow is the most important. So you've got the order of taking the full ordination is what determines your seniority in rank. So those who have taken vows earlier have higher seniority. Those who have taken them later have lower seniority. And so those with the earlier vows are considered higher. They're considered senior. Those with lower seniority are considered junior. In the Vinaya, there's no consideration of your ages, where you put the older people are on the higher rank and those at lower ranks. There's no such seniority in the Vinaya. For example, these days, elderly people who have reached the age of 80 and younger people who are the ages of 20, if someone who's 80 and someone who's 20 take the full ordination together, if the 20-year-old takes the vow first and the elder one takes it later, then then the 20-year-old sits above the older one because it's taken according to the order in which you've taken the vows, not according to your age. So that's one point. Now, another important point is that there's no tradition of doing it according to your realization. So sometimes we arrange it according if you have a higher realization, and those lower realization put lower. But there's nothing like that in the Vinaya. Whatever your level of realization, there's no. It's all the seniority is entirely according to the vows, and not according to realization. There's no saying to someone, "Oh, you have higher realization, have to sit higher." So the order of taking vows is emphasized, and that is the strict rule of the Vinaya. Now, if I close that now, if I kind of digress on this, so generally, within our society, what we consider is that seniority is based upon age. But as I said, in the Vinaya, it's not. It's taken on the length of time you've held the vows. Those who have held it for longer are senior, and those who have taken it a shorter time are juniors. Now, in the mantra, there is consideration of the levels of realization or the levels of wisdom. So this does occur in Vinaya, where you give someone higher seniority because of higher realization and so forth. But there's no such thing in the mantra. But in our Tibetan society, there's a particular tradition of determining it by the height of your rank that you receive. So those who are the stronger, the more privileged, are in the higher seat, and those with less privilege are on a lower seat. Now, there's a text by Karma Chapman called Mountain Dharma. Perhaps you know about it. And there's a song in there called The Song of Higher, Lower Thrones and Ranks. Now, what he says in this song is that the considering the height of thrones and of privilege are actually the sign from the Chinese imperial tradition. It's not a Vinaya it's not a Vinaya tradition. It's not a Vajrayana tradition. It's a Chinese imperial tradition. And with the Chinese emperors, the way we speak about it in Tibet, when we talk about the Mongol dynasty, these are the Yuan dynasty in Chinese. And then we also talk about the Ming dynasty. And then later there was also the Qing dynasty. In any case, during the Yuan dynasty and during the Ming dynasty, and in the Qing dynasty, during those 3 years, there are many Tibetan lamas who were invited to be the main gurus to Chinese emperors. For example, during the time of the Yuan dynasty, the most important, the most highly ranked Tibetan Lama who was a guru to the emperor and had a high position was Chogyam Pempa. During the Ming dynasty, it was the Karmapa Dishin Shenpa. Later during the Qing dynasty, it was the Dalai Lama who was given this position. And not only this, it's not only them. There are many lamas who became the main lamas to Chinese emperors. And once they've been put in that position, then everyone had to pay great respect to them. Because if you didn't pay respect to the emperor's guru, then you were not paying respect to the emperor. And so once you've become the emperor's guru, then they put a particular seat. They gave you a red stamp, and you had the idea there was a tradition of having a high throne and playing the gyalings when you come and so forth. So there are many privileges of being a high lama. Now, in worldly terms, these are important. And this is something that we do need to respect. But in terms of the Dharma, if we ask, is rank and privilege, is that important? It is not important at all. Now, the reason why it's not important If we give example of it, to give one example, we have our Kagyu forefathers, Marpa the Translator, there's the Lord of Yoga, Milarepa, and also the unparalleled Gampopa. Similarly, there is the glorious Jisum Champa, there's Jikun Kampa, and Tang Tampa. Now, these are gurus are actual Buddhas who'd actually come. Now, did they have any position that was granted by the emperor? Did they have that? No. Did they have any were they given any red seal? No, they didn't. Did they have any thrones or privileges? No. We had this discussion about the four elder and 8 younger Kagyu lineages, but in case if you think about the 8 younger lineages, now whether this is a good term or the origin of the 8 younger lineages is the Drogten Palmo Drugpa, who was the student of Gampopa, who had the widest activity, and he had over 5,800 people who merited to have parasols above their heads, who deserved a lot of respect. And when he gave empowerments and instructions to them, he just sat on a meditation cushion. He basically just had a thin skin as his seat. So even though he had such a great experiencing realization, but he only sat on a very thin seat. And it's not like he sat down and he got upset about sitting on a low seat, that I'm an important person, I've got a lot of realization. It's not like he had any fire burning his belly about that. He didn't. Similarly, there's a story that's related to this. Milarepa's student, who was said to be like the sun, was Gampopa, and the one said to be like the moon was Rechungpa, right? No, Rechungpa. So Rechung Dojo Japa was one day. He thought, maybe I'll get some tea, and he went to a Kadampa monastery. And when the monks in the Kadampa monastery were sitting in the ranks, then Rechungpa went and he sat at the end of the row. But Rechungpa, he himself just always wore like a white cotton robe. That's because he was a yogi. He didn't have any monastic robes to wear. And so because of this, then the discipline master, someone who is looking at saying, you white goat have no place with a sheep. It's not okay for you to worm your way in with them. You immediately have to leave. He told him to go. There's no question of him to say yes or no. He took Rechungpa by his arm and threw him out the door. No, not only while they were throwing him out, Rechungpa himself, even before he had time to get out of the door, they closed the door really quick. One of his feet got stuck in the door, and the door was closed really hard, and it really crushed his foot. And Rechungpa really felt incredible pain. You would, right? If your foot was stuck in the door, it would hurt, right? And when it hurt, then at that point, Rechungpa got upset or was sad and sang a song. And when he sang the song, at that point, there's a Kadampa Chayula, who was a very well-known Kadampa master, and he heard the song. And he thought, oh, this Rechungpa, these are really different than others. He felt faith, and he shed some tears. And then in secret, he would then call Rechungpa to see him, and he'd receive teachings from him, and he followed him as his root guru. So in this way, if we look at this story, then Rechungpa didn't get a seat, not even at the end of the road, forget about the head. But even then, Chayura also followed him as a guru and received teachings from him. So it's like there's no distinction of rank in actuality. There's another story. So one time there was a Sakya monastery in Tsangka. You can sometimes called the Sakya. I'm not sure if it's the Sakya main monastery, another one, but anyways, there's a monastery in Tsang, and there was a big dispute among the monks about who would sit where in the rows, like who should sit where, should be higher and lower, and because it was such a big dispute. So at that time there was a great scholar, a master named Sangat Tsundu Sengye. He was really known for his study of logic and validity and epistemology. And when he went to that monastery, he only got a seat at the end of the row, not at the top of the row. And he was kind of offended that he was putting there because he was a little bit proud about being so learned. He's like, someone, a scholar like me, is forced to sit at the end of the row, and I don't get a good seat. So he probably got a little offended. So the next day, when the sun was just rising, when they're doing the puja, he brought a donkey, right? So he brought this donkey, and he dressed the donkey in a shamtab and the 3 dharma robes and brought it into the shrine room and brought it to the top of the head of the row. And when he brought this to the head of the row, then everyone said, "What's up? What's going on? Why is he bringing in a donkey? Bringing a donkey into the shrine room?" And when they asked about it, then this master Tsangat said, "If you need a good voice, he's got one. So let's put him at the head of the row." So I think we can understand from this is that normally, because the umzes have good voices, and because of that, they're made into the umze. And when you're the chant master, the umze, then you have to sit at the head of the row. Otherwise, the chant masters, they don't have anything else. They have a good voice, and they wear nice clothes, and so they're made to sit at the head of the row. And so today I'm going to bring this, and so the donkeys have a K, right? This donkey has a really good voice, and I've dressed him up really nicely. So why not put him up at the top of the row? This is what he said. So Karma Chagme said that there's something important to understand in what Tsangat was saying. What we should understand is that if you have qualities in high realization, then even if you're made to sit at the end of the row, then in actuality it's the head of the row. It's because you're the one with the greatest experience and realization. If you do not have any qualities of experience and realization, if you don't even have the pure discipline, then if you're sitting at the end of the row, if the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas seeing, they'll see that you're seated at the head of the row. They don't see you as at the foot of the row. So what this shows is that what's important is how much experience and how much realization you have is what is important, not where you're sitting in the rows. Likewise, in Tibet, there's also there's another way of determining your order. And this is called the rushing ranks, the way of doing this. What this meant is the rushing ranks meant that instead of arranging the ranks according to seniority or anything, all of the Sangha members would wait by the door of the monastery, and then the discipline master, when they said run, they'd all rush in. And whoever got to the top of the row, the head of the row, could stay at the head of the row. And so there's that tradition. And this is what's called a rushed rank. You rush in and you run in to go to the, so whoever gets there first is able to sit there. So this is the tradition that they had. I heard about this before. I've heard about it before at one monastery. I don't need to say the name of which. Now, basically, when you talk about the rushing, it's considered very important, because if you have it, because it's like a connection that allows you to have a great a great sangha. And so this is something that they do at many. So this one monastery had this tradition of doing the rushed rankings. And so there's this pillar there. And so whoever got to that pillar first, they would give them a yak. So all the sangha members were like pressed together, like until they're almost dying, and then rush as fast as they could to the pillar. And some of them like had big cracked their heads and their big blood all over their foreheads because they'd run and they'd hit their heads on the pillar and so forth and various things. And so by the end of it, everyone, when they had any pujas, then everyone was like their faces were all bloody. And sometimes when you hear about these things, you think about these really strange customs in Tibet. So in brief, sitting privileges in the height of the is just a real pain. And the Druk Gyalwang said, the root of the eight worldly dharmas comes from sitting ranks. So have fixed sittings, have no fixed sittings. So he says that basically the eight worlds come from your ranking in the seats. And so if you could live it and make everyone the same. So and if we look at history, there have been, more than a few conflicts caused by disputes over higher and lower sitting positions or higher low thrones, privilege rank. There have been a lot of such conflicts. Even when we've had the Kagyu Munlam tradition, Kagyu Munlam, when we invite great lamas from Kagyu and other schools, our greatest worry is not whether we're going to be able to host the lama, but the question, if the guru comes, how high of a throne we should have for them once they arrive and who we should put on the right or left. That's what we worry most about. When we have organizational meetings for this, then people have various different opinions. And so when I express my opinion, what I always say is, unless we don't invite a guest, but once we have invited them, then even if we're unable to give them a welcome and preparations that surpass their highest expectations, at the very least, we need to satisfy them. We must not offend them. And likewise, if we pay respect to them and put them in a high position, that doesn't diminish us. If it's the opposite, we put someone at a low position and we stay in a high position, then in actuality, you're diminishing yourself. And so when there are such situations like that, we need to be able to think in a way that is appropriate for the situation and the time. And we need to understand what the main point is. Otherwise, we say, the Karmapa has such a status in China and Tibet, and so that no one be seated on a higher throne. If we speak in this way, and this shows that we're actually kind of brainless and have a small heart. It's not something that you'd say if you have a really open, a great heart and a lot of intelligence. So that's what I say, and in myself, that's how I see it. So I basically think the Vinaya tradition of seniority of vows is the best way to do it. It is the least complicated version. So that's just a digression. So I'm going to continue with the main meaning of the text. Now the next question is the livelihood of the Sangha was one that is free of the enjoyment of sensory pleasures. It's like we worldly people, we always enjoy staying with our bellies full and enjoying ourselves. But that's not how the Sangha lived. For example, after noon, you were not allowed to eat food. And there are strict rules against playing any sort of game or any sport or so forth. There is no such thing allowed. Likewise, from the moment you woke up in the morning until you went to bed in the evening, you primarily had to practice the Dharma only. For example, after you wake up in the morning and wash your face, then you'd put on your robes properly and go to your Kempo or Acharya to study the Vinaya. You would request the transmission of the Vinaya. And what this meant at that time, requesting a tradition is different than when we talk about receiving transmissions now. You'd go to the Kempo or the Acharya, they would to them, and they would recite the words, and then you would then repeat them. And so you'd study it orally. You'd repeat it orally in order to memorize it. So you recite it 3 times, then you do the minimum of 3 times to memorize it. And what this is called is the teacher, the Kempo and teachers are giving the transmission and the students receiving. That means memorizing it. And they're said to have received as much as they had memorized. And so you also have to think about the meaning, and considering the meaning was also contemplating. So repeating and reciting was listening, and then thinking about was contemplating. Then you also had to practice dhyana meditation, and you had to study that. And also to the time during the Buddha's lifetime, you should go to the Buddha and receive Dharma teachings from that. And if you have any doubts or questions, you should ask them. And so this was the custom during that time. So in the morning, after you'd done all of these morning activities, then before noon, what you had to do was you had to go to the villages and towns to beg for alms. In other words, you had to go and beg for food. You'd go beg for food, and then you should have to finish your meal before noon, because afternoon you could not. So you have to finish your meal by noon. In our Tibetan tradition, Tibetan schools, it talks about going for on the alms rounds. It talks about the many reasons why we'd have to go begging for food. Now, one of the reasons is that when you go to when you go for the so one of the main reasons is that you'd be in the monastery, which actually in those days meant you're in a retreat, in an isolated place. So you'd go from that isolated place, and then you go into the towns or villages to beg for food, and then you'd return to your isolated place for your meditation. And in the doing so, you had to take a lot of steps, and so that naturally gave them good exercises. So it gave good exercises. Maybe you can say it's good exercise or good for your fitness. And so in this way, it was good for the body. Likewise, and also because you had to keep this discipline of not eating after noon and so forth, and then the householders would say, "Oh, they're different than anyone else. We couldn't do that," and so they would praise them and pay them homage and so forth. And also there was, because it purifying the offerings. If the offerings, people would think that if I make an offering to the bhikshus, then I'll gain merit. So because they think that way, it said like they were a purification of the offerings. And in particular, because they had to live off of alms from others, then they could they had to have pure conduct and do what other people thought is good. They had no choice but to do it, because if they did not, they would not get any food. And so since you had to go on the alms round, it helped naturally made your conduct pure, and it also your pride of thinking that you couldn't just go off and show off saying, you have to give me food. You have to be, so it also had this benefit of diminishing your pride. In any case, the monastics only had one meal a day. And you had to finish this by before noon, exactly. And if after noon, you were not allowed to eat at all. Now, in our Tibetan Sarvastivada translations, then the main reason why bhikshus and novices were not allowed to eat after noon, so that's not just so if you're just saying that you can't do that. So what is the reason why you weren't allowed to eat after noon? What happens if you do eat? What is the reason? If you eat after noon, then naturally you become fat. And in particular, if you eat late at night, then you get fat. And you also get sleepy and you get lethargic, right? You get really dull. So dullness means when your mind is not clear and you're kind of like blank in your mind. So that happens quite a lot. So for this reason, and this creates obstacles to listening, contemplating, and meditating. And so if we don't, so we don't meditate that much dhyana meditation. So we just, whether you get sleepy or not, we don't really see if it's much of a thing. But if you're actually practicing dhyana meditation, you need to have really clear awareness. Because you need such clear awareness, you have a little bit of sleepiness or dullness. If you have unclarity in your mind, then this is incredible difficulty in the dhyana meditation. And so for that reason, that's the main reason for not eating after noon. However, some people, if they don't get food after noon, they're like their bodies start to tremble, like these days, if you think. Like people who have diabetes these days. Or people have very low blood sugar level. If they don't get food, then their body begins to tremble and they aren't able to practice. And so there's an exception from they are allowed to eat after noon. The reason why they need to eat it is because such people are allowed to eat after noon is because if they don't eat food, that causes problems and it gives them the great suffering of hunger. And that also makes an obstacle to listening, contemplating, and meditation. So this kind of negates the earlier reasoning for not eating. And if you don't eat, it creates an obstacle to listening, contemplating, meditation. So that sort of individual is allowed to eat after noon. And so that is an exception for them. And then once you've finished your meal, once you've finished your food and eaten, then you just sit under a tree and practice dhyana meditation. This is what the monastics in ancient India did. And as they did their dhyana meditation, then they would stay until just about the sun's just about to set. And and when the sun was about to set, they would get up. And if there was a shrine hall or an assembly hall, they'd gather there. And then once they'd gathered there, then they would discuss what experiences they'd had in their dhyana meditation, what sort of experience and realization. They would compare with each other. Or they would go see their Kempo and their Acharya teacher, and they would have discussion, ask questions and guidance. Or if the Buddha was present in that area, they'd go to the Buddha and ask him about their questions or doubts. So it's a tradition also of going to see the Buddha. In brief, in those days, the lifestyle of those the lifestyle of the monastics is one where they spoke only of they never spoke of worldly things and only speak about the Dharma. It's because normally we speak about all sorts of worldly things, and if you speak about that, you don't speak about worldly things and spend your time only speaking about the Dharma. If you speak only about Dharma-related things, if you think about all sorts of worldly things such as politics and all that, then you weren't allowed to speak about those. You should spend your time only speaking about the Dharma. This is a very strong tradition at that time. Now, later, then you'd return to your monastic cell and continue practicing dhyana meditation until you went to bed. So fundamentally, on basic level, all of the activities, the daily life of the Sangha were like that. So basically, all the way the members of the Sangha should lead their lives and how the activities they did in their daily life had to be done according to the rules of the Vinaya, or of the codes of conduct. So it was a very strict code of conduct. Now, the main work of the monastic community is to practice Dharma. They didn't have any other job to do, and so their main job was to do this. And that practice of Dharma means doing listening and contemplating and meditation. And this is in order to gain the results of nirvana. So once you become realist, and the reason why you need to try to work hard in a different way than others is in order to make is for the sake of achieving nirvana. And so for this reason, all the monastics worked really hard, and they had a very particular lifestyle that's really different than our current lifestyle. You could say it's a hard lifestyle. It's a difficult lifestyle. And that is primarily in order to listen, contemplate, and meditate. So I think this is maybe a good place to take our 30-minute break. Next, we need to speak about the Rains Retreat. So I will speak about the Rains Retreat. Now, the topic of the Rains Retreat is that the Buddha and his monastic disciples, right? Normally they would go to travel without any fixed destinations. They had to go to all sorts of places. They'd walk all over, and they had to go traveling. So they would travel from one place to another. It's rare that they spent a long time in any one place. So there was like no fixed place that they stayed. They're always moving. And this is one aspect of their practice. For example, later, we had many great Tibetan cities who were like very simple lifestyles and yogis who also would practice in no fixed location. Like Milarepa would go to many different, various different places on the border of Tibet and Nepal. And so it's similar during the time of the original spread of Buddhism at the time of the Buddha. The Buddha himself, as well as all of the students in his retinue, would go to different places. And they'd spend their time traveling. And they did not stay permanently in any single location. However, every year in India, there are 3 months of monsoon. In the summer, there are 3 months of a rainy season, right? And so these 3 months of the monsoon probably begin on the month of the Ashada, the full month after June, July. And they'd stay there for the next 3 months. And so if you're unable to stay during this earlier Rains Retreat, you can stay in the later Rains Retreat, which began what is called the Shravanика month, which began the day after the full moon in June, July, and August. In any case, for 3 months, the Sangha members all stayed in a single place and performed the activities of the Rains Retreat or the Varshavasana. Now, at this actually very moment, many of our monasteries are holding the Rains Retreat. So I thought I should speak a little bit more about the topic of the Rains Retreat. Now, there are several points that are related to rains retreat, and I can't speak about them all, but I thought it'd be good to speak a few of them. And the first of these is in general, we have the earlier and the later rains retreats, right? We have these two, the earlier and the later. And if you whether you're sitting for the earlier or the later rains retreat, whichever one you're staying for, it's said in the Vinaya that you must sit for a 3-month retreat. But these days, most Tibetan monasteries do the rains retreat for 1.5 months, not for 3 months. So you might wonder, is there sort of a source in the Vinaya that says you may stay for only 1.5 months instead of staying for 3 months? So is there any source or any quotation in the Vinaya for this? So generally, when we're doing the rains retreat ceremony, we always make the promise to stay for the 3 summer months. But if there are some circumstances that prohibit you from spending 3 months in retreat, there are exceptions. It's not that you absolutely must stay for 3 months. Now, in Tibet, our practices, according to the Mula Sarvastivada tradition, basically are based on the teachings in the Vinaya Sutras. And what it says in the Vinaya Sutras is, after you have made the commitment for 3 months, if you hear that some sort of combative bhikshu, one who makes a lot of problems, is coming to your place, if you know that they're coming to your to where you're staying, after you have held 2 or 3 poshada or sojong ceremonies, then you may hold the pravarana at the end of the rains retreat ceremony. Likewise, there's also a master named Dharmamitra who wrote a long commentary on the Vinaya Sutras. This is a well-known commentary. And what it says in this is that after committing to do the rains retreat, and you've done 2 or 3 poshadas or sojongs, then either on a full moon or a new moon, so that means either the 15th day of the lunar month or the 30th day, if you do the pravarana, then it's okay. And this is because you have spent half of the 3 months of the rains retreat, or you have stayed 2/3 of the rains retreat. And so within that time, if there are because of circumstances, you're unable to stay in the rains retreat, then even just doing that, you get all the benefits of doing the rains retreat. Now, the reason for this is that it says in both the Vinaya Sutra and the commentary that doing half of something is doing it. It's a common expression in the world, and it's also doing most of it is doing it, as it's said among the noble beings. And so if you say, so even if you're able to spend half of the rains retreat or the 2/3 of it, then that's enough. Likewise, in Tibet, our most Tibetan commentary are the commentary by Tsongkhapa, and also and there's also the Vinaya commentary, the String of Jewels. And also there's the Mikyo Dorje's commentary, the Orb of the Sun. And what it says in these is that sometimes while you're staying in a rains retreat, you hear that there's someone who makes a lot of problems, someone who's really combative. And you hear that he might come to the place where you're staying the rains retreat. Or if you're having difficulty in getting enough food during the rains retreat. And if you're having difficulties getting any medicines that you need for your health, if there are such difficulties, then you don't necessarily need to you can stay in the rains retreat. Instead, you can just do, even if there is only, even if you only done half of the rains retreat, it's okay. You may leave, it is said. However, the point here is that what I said before is that when there's some sort of circumstance that occurs, if there's a difficulty that happens, only then can you have that exception and do the Pravarana ritual. Otherwise, if there's no such difficulty, but if it's just sort of like a custom, and when you recite the ceremony, you commit to staying 3 months, but in actuality, you only stay 1.5 months without any of those conditions. And so that's the tradition that we have, right? That's a custom we practice now. And that sort of a custom, if you say, is there a source for that in Vinaya or not? It's difficult to say that there is a source, I think. In any case, I have not seen any source for doing this. So generally, with the Pravarana, the ceremony at the end of the rains retreat, there are 3 types. So there's doing it at the proper time, doing it suddenly, or doing it communally. So when you do the Pravarana, the ceremony at the end of the rains retreat, at the proper time, this means that if you commit to the rains retreat on the 16th of the 5th Tibetan month, then you do the Pravarana on the full moon of the 8th. If you commit to do the rains retreat on the 16th of the 6th month, then you do the Pravarana, the end of rains retreat ceremony on the full moon of the 9th. And if you do the late rains retreat starting in the 7th month, then you need to do the Pravarana on the 10th month. If you must stay for the so if you do the late rains retreat starting on the 7th Tibetan month and the full moon, you need to, the day after the full moon, you need to start on the full moon, end on the full month of the 10th. So in any case, if you're staying for the full duration of the 3 months and then do the Pravarana, the end of rains retreat ceremony, this is doing it at the proper time. So once you have finished the duration of the retreat, you do the Pravarana ceremony. Now, there are people who say that the early rains retreat needs to start in the 5th month, and some that say that it starts in the 6th Tibetan month. There are these 2 different opinions, but this is something I think we need to investigate. Particularly these days in the Theravada tradition, the Theravada tradition starts on the 16th of the 5th Tibetan month. And the Vaishakha month, the Sagadawa, matches our 3rd Tibetan month. During the time of the Buddha, the longest day of the summer, the summer solstice, that time, when it happens, always happened during the earlier rains retreat. These days, if we look at today's days, the summer solstice is in the 6th Tibet, is in the month of June, the Western month of June. You say the Western month of June, so somewhere around the 20th of June, there's what we call that in the Tibetan tradition is basically in the 5th Tibetan month. Similarly, in the Vinaya, the Vaisakha month is said to be the last month of spring. But these days in the Tibetan astronomy, we can actually then the Sagadawa falls in the first summer month. It doesn't happen in the last spring month. So there's a difference of 1 month between the 2. Now, if we do it a month earlier, then on the one perspective, it is in accord with the Theravada tradition. And it is also in accord with the contemporary astronomy. But this is something that everyone need to think about and need to consider. Now, the reason for this is all these topics are related with the 3 fundamental rituals of the Vinaya. And it is said that if the rituals are practiced assiduously, and if they are not, then the teachings are not present. if they're practiced assiduously, the teachings are present, and if they're not, the teachings are not present. And so it's not okay for us not to do them properly. So that's speaking about the pravarana at the proper time. Then there's a sudden pravarana. So sudden pravarana, sudden end to the rains retreat, is, as I said before, that's how we do when there's some circumstances, as I described before. There's some circumstances where you're unable to stay. You have taken it as a basis that you're going to stay for 3 months, and it's fixed that you're going to stay for 3 months, but you take it as a granted that you're going to spend 3 months and make the plans to do so, but you are unable to spend 3 months because of some unfortunate circumstance. Some difficulty happens. And then what you need to do then is that after 2 or 3 pushadas, the 2 or 3 sojong or pushada ceremonies, then on either a full or on a new moon, then you can do the pravarana. And this is what we call a sudden pravarana. Actually, you need to do it at the end of 3 months, but because of some particular situation, you can do it before the 3 months are finished. So like if you're doing like a month and a half or so, then at that point you can do the pravarana. So this is what we call a sudden pravarana. And it's also the communal pravarana. And so what this means is, according to the Vinaya Vastu and the Vinaya Sutras, is when bhikshus are staying in some remote place and all of a sudden there's a threat to their lives. Like there are bandits who are come, or there's a flood. All of a sudden there's a big danger. And they don't have time to do the pravarana ritual, and they suddenly have to, and they can't wait till the 16th or the full month. So they don't have time to the pravarana ritual. And so these bhikshus just pack up their things. Now, of course, they didn't have many things at all. They just folded up their dharma robes. And they would say to each other, the bhikshus said, actually, today we should be doing it on the 15th, but we've got this big danger. So we've had this difficulty. So we can't do it properly today. So let's just all go off where we're going to go. But once again, in the future, we're going to get together to do, if we have, we need to have some day where we can all get together and do the pravarana ritual properly. And if they leave then that's called a communal pravarana. Another way is like a designating that is, they don't have the actual time to do it, but they kind of designate it as a pravarana and say that in the future, they'll actually do the actual pravarana. And so that's what we call a communal pravarana. The reason why it's called a communal pravarana is because there's some danger, and at that time, they can't actually do the pravarana, but they can't do it, but they said that after 3 months, the Sangha will be able to gather together. Then at that point, they would say, "We'll do it," and so they make the discusses communally, and then they leave. So that's what we call the communal pravarana. So the difference between the sudden and the communal pravarana, they're very similar, right? So what's the difference? Both of them are actually you're supposed to stay for the 3 months. At the end of 3 months after you start the rains retreat, you do the pravarana. But before that, you're doing some sort of a pravarana because of circumstance. So they're very similar in this regard. But the difference between the two is that the sudden is that in terms of time, is after 2 or 3 pushadas. They've already done those 2 or 3 pushadas, and then you hold the pravana, and you have to do the whole pravana ceremony, which has to happen on either full moon or on a new moon. And so you do that on the full or the new moon, and then you leave. It's not that you're leaving without doing the pravarana ceremony. But the communal pravarana, there's no difference like how many pushada ceremonies have gone by. So at the begin, you begin the rains retreat on one day, and then the next day you have to flee because of some danger, then that's okay. So there's a difference. There's a difference that whether or not you have to consider whether there are 2 or 3 differences, and you don't have to do the pravarana and things. It's like let's all go off on the road, and then we'll get together and do that. Just basically saying that, and that's enough. And so for this reason, we look at this. What's clear here if there are such bad circumstances or such a danger, then you need to stay in the rains retreat for 3 months and do the pravardhana. And if in the middle you have to leave after staying a month and a half, and there's nothing like that. And if there's no particular danger that happens or hardship that happens, then you generally need to you must stay for 3 months. So, like once when we had the Kaju Gunsha conferences, we discussed the practices of 3 basic rituals. And that time, many of the monasteries saw that staying in the rains retreat for 3 months was in accord with the Vinaya, and they all had the intention that they are going to. Most of the monasteries then began the practice of doing the 3-month rains retreats. And I thought that this was actually really putting your words into practice and really doing the practice of the 3 fundamental rituals of the teachings. And so this is something that's worthy of rejoicing about and is praiseworthy. And I think that if it's possible, if there's not a whole lot of difficulty, then I think that if it's possible for all the monasteries to stay for 3 months, then that is good. Now, that's basically just a digression. So next, what I would like to speak about is the discussion of the earlier and the later rains retreats. I thought I should speak a bit about this. When we talk about the early and the later rains retreats, it means should you commit to the earlier rains retreat or the later rains retreat? So generally, you should commit to the earlier rains retreat. You're not allowed to just commit to the later rains retreat. If there's no way for you to be able to commit to the earlier retreats, if there's some sort of difficulty or danger, and there's no way for you to commit to the earlier rains retreat, then you must commit to the later rains retreat. If there's still another difficulty or danger, and you have no opportunity to commit to the later rains retreats, then there is no fault to that. Because the Buddha is not saying you shouldn't do something that you can't do. It says you try to do it, but if you try hard and if you're not able to, it doesn't mean that you absolutely have to do it. So the Buddha said he didn't say that you have to insist on doing it. If you're unable to stay for the earlier rains retreat and then unable to stay for the later retreats, and then is there the fault of not holding the rains retreat? There is none. Like, for example, if you're in a region where there are no bhikkhus, and if there are only novices and there's no bhikkhus, then in that location, you aren't allowed to do the rains retreat. So this is the situation. So there's no problem, even if you aren't able to do the rains retreat. In any case, all of these digressions here are according to the Tibetan Mulasarvastivada. So now I'm going to return to our actual topic. So when I return to the actual topic, you might wonder, how is it that the rains retreat began? What is the reason for holding a rains retreat? Now, the Buddhas and his disciples normally just went to all various different places. There are no certain places they stayed. They had no permanent location where they stayed. And they'd just spend their time under some tree. It's not like there weren't any big monasteries like we have these days. However, in India, there's really strong rains. And so because there are such rains, there's a difficulty of being floods. And so that gives difficulties. Likewise, when all the vegetation would grow, the grass and all the shrubs and everything would grow, and all the poison sticks and all the different types of mosquitoes and other insects would be everywhere. And they sometimes would bite people and could even take people's lives. And if also the people when they're going would actually kill the bugs and insects. And so there's a danger that it actually cause a danger to both of their lives. So for the 3 months of the monsoon, it was unnecessary to go out. Instead, you'd stay in one location. These days, there's no particular point when we need to stay, because we are always staying in a monastery. So for these reasons, we see no particular reasons to stay in one place, because we're not moving around the way they used to go. We stay in a single place. But the time of the Buddha and his disciples and time of original Buddhism, as I mentioned before, the bhikshus didn't just stay in a single place. They're just always wandering and traveling from place to place. They're always in these isolated places. And as they're going to these places, during the 3 months of the monsoon, they had to relax and spend 3 months in one place. And so for that reason, the rains retreat had a particular feeling to it. So for the rest of these, we're always staying in the monastery. So what's special about the rains retreat? It's just like a particular ritual we do. It's not like there's something idea of staying in a retreat in a place. We just don't have any like sort of feeling for like there's like any thought of this being a different special feeling. So in general, the reason for doing the tradition of the rains retreat is not only a Buddhist practice, it also occurred in other religions. There's a modern scholar named S.R. Goyal. And what he says is that the rains retreat is practiced in common by the Brahmins or the Jains or the Digambaras. So often we call them the Digambaras and Ekadasas, but the best name is from the Jains, and then there's the Buddhists. So it was a common practice. It was not only a Buddhist practice. The Brahmins also practice it. The Jains also practice it. And the Buddhists practice it. So all three do this in common. It's a common tradition. And we talk about the rains retreat. The reason why I say the rains retreat, during the literally it's translated as staying for the rains. And so for the three months of the rains, it would stay in a single place. And during that 3 months of the monsoon season, the stay in a circulation depend upon the generosity of the local faithful people in that area. Because they would depend upon, they had to stay in a single place and rely on the local community of that area. And likewise also for the public of that area, there's a great benefit for them. And the reason for that is because the Sangha would stay there for a long time. They'd stay there for 3 months. And during that time, they had the opportunity to receive Dharma teachings from them. And so at that time, the rains retreat is like really a bridge that created a deeper and stronger connection between the Sangha and the faithful public. So usually there wasn't much of a connection. And so when they stayed there, it gave them a great opportunity to make a connection to the local public. But in any case, as they stayed there for 3 months, there was a lot more interaction there are many more opportunities for the Sangha to interact with the public and to make a connection with them. So it's like this bridge that creates a bridge that connects a connection between the Sangha and the public. And this is what this Indian scholar says. And so in any case, as the monsoon approaches in India, then the monastic would stop doing their traveling or their wandering. So like normally at the end of the rains retreat, after Pravadana ceremony, like we go walk for a couple of kilometers, right? So what we're doing now is actually just kind of like a symbolic. We just go out for a little bit and then we walk back. Actually, in the old days, the wandering, the traveling was not like this. It's actually going from one place to another, moving to another place. They didn't have any actual place of this day. There were no monasteries in the old days. There weren't such big monasteries where many people could stay and gather. I will speak about this more in more detail later. So you had to move and go from one place to the next. Next time I'm going to go there. Let's say I'm going to stay here for a few days, then I'm going to go on to the next place. And this is what we call the traveling. So it's like traveling to countries. So going as traveling to countries is the literal translation. So it's traveling. And so they would take a break from the traveling and they'd stay in 3 months. And then all the wandering monks would gather at a fixed date every year. They'd gather it and have the rains retreat. And you have to do it at a fixed time every year, right? So they'd have the rains retreat every year at the same time. And this was the custom. Now, while holding the rains retreat, the monastics would have to continue to go beg for their alms. And so the rains retreat couldn't be off at some like incredibly far off remote location. If you did that, you wouldn't get any food. So the place where you hold the rains retreat had to be near a city or a town. It has to be in the region of the vicinity of one. Because if you're near the town or the city, then it's easier to go beg for alms. And then based on the environment of the Rinzhen, there are two different types. So based on the difference in the environment, there are two of them. One of them was called Avasa. And the second is called Arama. And if you translate Avasa, it means like into English, it'd be like a denmahas, and the Arama would mean like a pleasant grove. So basically, during the rains retreat, when they'd stay, the places they'd stay, and they'd be called different things according to the differences in the environment of this. Some of them would be called dwelling places, and some would be called pleasant groves. So there are these two different types. But these places where they held the rains retreat originally were places that they stayed during while they're holding the rains retreat. But they weren't like the monasteries we have now, where you stayed permanently. They were just places where you stayed temporarily. They were not permanent residences at all. But as the monastic would come back and spend the rains retreat at the same place year after year, then it became like a permanent location. And so many Sangha members would gather there. They do the Poshada, and they do the Pravarana, and then they do the Katina ceremony there. And so there are many programs that were held there. And so eventually the Sangha kind of settled in those locations. And the owners of these places, who owned the owners of the dwelling places and the aramas, would then continually invite the Sangha to come back and say, please, you have to come back and do the rains retreat at my place again. It's possible they'd have said this, so the sponsor would continue to make offerings for them, and so the Sangha members would also get used to going there. And likewise, also the dwelling places and the pleasant groves became like first they're only permanent places, but they became semi-permanent places. They weren't permanent residences all, but gradually, as you came there year after year, then they naturally became like semi-permanent places for them to stay. They became like permanent places to stay, but they still at that places, they didn't really have the sort of the form of a monastery. It's not like there are monasteries we have today. They just had places where the bhikshus would stay during the rains retreat. And they had places where they would make boundaries, as you have to do in the Vinaya for the Vinaya children. So they had places where you could do that. So it's just that they made the boundaries as before, but it wasn't like some sort of like an organized monastery like we have today. It wasn't like that. So what's the reason why the monastics had to lead such difficult lives with so few things? Wandering all sorts of places, going begging for your food. And during 3 months, you'd have a definite place to stay, but it's not like it's a definite place. It's just some place that someone else had given you. It's not something that belonged to you at the beginning. So what's the reason why the monastics had to lead such a difficult livelihood? The main reason why they had to lead their lifestyle was to have few desires and be content, to decrease our greed, and to be content even with just with meager food. So even if you have meager food and clothing, then to be just content with that. The main thing is, instead of spending our time looking for food and clothing, is to spend the time practicing Dharma. And that's the reason why there had to be this particular style of living. The aim of the monastics is very close. The aim of the monastic lifestyle is very, very clear. The reason to have such a difficult lifestyle is, if the aim is not clear to you, then you don't see any point to doing that lifestyle. If you have a clear aim, you think the reason why I'm doing this, and my reason is aim, if it's clear to you, and it's also a very simple way, even though it seems really complicated, and it doesn't take a whole lot of time. So it's easy to put into practice, and it doesn't create any obstacles to your practice. And these days, when we talk about the Vinayas, when we study the Vinaya, then it's really quite complicated. But at the very beginning, the Vinaya was not. It's just that it got the rules. They're just gradually there were more and more rooms, and during the time, most of the rules are made during the time of the Buddha. But there are some rules that seem to have been created that it's difficult to, many rules that were later added, that were probably added later. It's difficult to say that they're done by the Buddha. During the 1,000 or 1,500 years after, it's possible that the masters and the scholars of that time might have made some rules. Like, there are such famous monasteries in India, and they took whatever the rules in their own organization, and it's possible that they would have added these to the Vinaya. In any case, these days, the Vinaya seems to be like something that's difficult to practice. But originally, during the early times, in terms of the Indian society of that time, it's something that allowed you to to devote your life to practice. And also, there are the Brahmins and the Jains who practiced austerities. They gave up even the most basic needs for living, and even didn't have any food to eat. They fasted. And they were like too extreme, and had too difficult a lifestyle. And this also would make their bodies weak, and they'd also get just discouraged them and made it difficult for them to practice. And so for that reason, it's avoiding the one side, it's not going down the path towards a lot of complicated lifestyle. And on the other hand, it's not doing like the Brahmins and Jains and doing a far too extremely ascetic lifestyle. So it is practicing a lifestyle that doesn't fall down either extreme, is the practice that the Buddha taught. And so this is the lifestyle that the Sangha practiced. So after this, I've spoken about the topics of Poshada and the Pravarana. Now, the topics of Poshada and Pravarana. So you've got the three fundamental rituals. One is the rains retreat. The other is the Sojong or Poshada. And then there's Pravarana. So I'm giving basically just introductions. I'm not speaking about how you do the entire practice. It's just an introduction. And this introduction is like kind of putting together the findings of contemporary researchers as well as those in our traditional Tibetan texts. So when we speak about Poshada, the Sojong, when the Buddha first appeared in ritually, at that time what happened is the Brahmins, what they always did is they always doing sacrifices and rituals. And so they considered it really important to do these sacrifices to the gods. They said everything depended upon these sacrifices. All of their activities, were peaceful or wrathful, all depended upon the sacrifices. And so if you do the sacrifices, then everything will be fine. So that was their view. And they also had really extremely complicated rituals. And so then they eventually became just like an external ritual. And they didn't really pay much attention to the internal practice. And instead, they really kind of spent their time like kind of overly fascinated by all the external aspects of rituals. And so the Buddha kind of made, like you could say, that there's refutation. They said there's no point to that. And so the Buddhists did not hold such a view. Likewise, the Buddhists at that time, one of the main reasons why Buddhism spread so much and spread at that time is that the Buddhists didn't always say that you all had to spend your time making offerings to the gods or to the Nagas, that you had to have these complicated rituals. They said they're not important. They said that the main thing is your actual practice. It is increasing experience and realization of the mind. This is what they considered important. And so people said, oh, this Buddha explanation is really nice. It's actually good. And so people liked that. And so this is one reason why Buddhism spread. So at that time, in the Buddhism, among the Buddhists, and there wasn't all this making sacrifice and reciting praises and reciting homages to the gods. There are lots of these rituals. Now, of course, there are a lot of these in our secret mantra, but at that time, at the time of original Buddhism, in the original Buddhism, if we're talking about that speaker, the Brahmanical lineages had a lot of complicated rituals and prostrations and praises and so forth. They considered it very important. But the Buddhists didn't take that up. They didn't do that. What the Buddha said is that you have to focus on achieving liberation yourself. And you need to stress this alone. And this is basically, you didn't do all these other rituals. You're primarily practicing only to gain liberation for yourself. Because the Buddha was emphasizing this, then your internal practice alone became most important. The external rituals, like for the societal rituals, were not so important. Rituals were something that the Brahmanas did, and they were very complicated, difficult. There weren't anything like that. For example, even the rituals of taking the vows were at the very beginning were extremely simple. Later, the rituals got longer, but at the very beginning, the rituals were very short. And I can speak about that later. There was just a very simple ritual for taking the vows. The main thing that the bhikshus would do is they'd give themselves counsel. They'd talk to themselves. They'd help each other, and they would encourage each other. One bhikshu would help another. They would give advice to each other. And so what was most important was to be able to proceed in that way. And so for this reason, if we look in the Vinaya, then the bhikshus, the Sangha would always come together and they do these different rituals. And then later there were different actions or ceremonies that they had to do. And the reason why they had to do this is so that they could advise each other and to encourage each other. And so that's one reason why they had to keep coming back together. So that's the aim for doing these things. It's so that the Sangha can gather again and over and do these rituals of performing actions. And the two of these most important rituals, of course, there are many of these, but the two most important such rituals, one of these was the Poshada or Sojong, and the second was the Pravarana. And to talk about Poshada, to give an explanation of the Sojong, this is something that we hold in this. We hold this in the monastery, but if we don't understand what Poshada is, then there's like no point to doing the ceremony. So to explain what Poshada or the Sojong is simply is something that wasn't originally a Buddhist practice. Originally, it was a non-Buddhist practice. It's something that the Brahmins did. Later, the Buddhists took the Buddhist tradition, and then it became a Buddhist practice. They took the Hindu practice and they made it their own. And so the Indian scholar S.R. Goyal says that originally there was no Buddhist Buddhist tradition of doing the Poshada. There was it was a non-Buddhist practice, not a Buddhist one. But later, the king Bimbisara offered his opinion to the Buddha that it would be a good idea to do the Poshada ceremony. And so the Buddha made the rule about observing Poshada. Likewise, this Indian scholar says that when the Poshada was originally instituted, the main thing that the texts that they recited during that time were the most important practices, instructions of the Buddha. They'd repeat these instructions several times. Later, I'll speak about more of this. I'll speak in more detail about this later. Later, so originally, speaking about the main instructions about the Four Noble Truths and reciting them over and over again. So you recite these over and over again during the main teachings over and over again. But later, the Buddha made all the rules in the Vinaya, and as he made more and more rules in the Vinaya, then what you recited in those, you recited the precepts of the Vinaya. You'd say the rules, or you're allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do this. In order so that they don't forget the rules, you'd recite them over and over again. So all the bhikshus would gather together, and they would review the Vinaya together. It's like they're doing their homework or having a studies hall, and they do the recording, reviewing them, and as if there are any violations of any precept. If someone had done some sort of offense that violated the Vinaya rules, then they must admit them to the Sangha without hiding them. And then the Sangha would then either look at the severity of the offense and either make a punishment, or they'd be lenient, or if it's a really strong one, they'd either expel the monk or make them confess. And so the ceremony or its occasions when they did this were called the Poshada. Now, in general, each month there were 6 days each month when Poshada was held. Now, this is not a Buddhist question. This is something that all the non-Buddhists also expected. And these 6 days were called, in terms of the waxing phase of the moon, the 8th and the 14th and 15th days. And during the waning phase, the 23rd, 29th, and 30th days. So these are the 6 days. In our secret mantra Vajrayana, we also include the 10th day of the waxing phase and the 10th day of the waning phase. We add these two. So these, so the 10th day of the waxing phase is the 10th, and the 10th day of the waning phase is the 25th of the Tibetan month. In any case, these 6 days were days that everyone, Buddhist or non-Buddhist, accepted as being the days for the Poshada. Everyone gathered and did Poshada on those days. And then on those days of the Poshada, then the lay community from around would come in particular to the monasteries in particular. They'd come to where the bhikshus or the Sangha were staying. They'd come to the Sangha. So these are what we call in Tibetan the auspicious days. And we have many different ways of talking about it. Something say that in the 8th, there's this particular date and all this. In the 15th, there's like the Indra will come. Some people, and the Indra will come to the world and see our people performing virtues or misdeeds. And so these are things that the non-Buddhists say. But in any case, then the one on the 8th day, one would come on the 14th, another would come 15th on the full moon day. Then God Indra himself would come and look over the world. But I don't remember them at all clearly. In any case, they'd considered these to be sacred days. And so on these days, the public would come to the where the monastery, where the Sangha was staying, and they'd take the five lay precepts, and they would also receive Dharma teachings. Now, in terms of the bhikshus, there were, for the Sangha, for the bhikshus Poshada, there are 2 times when this is held each month. So it's only done twice per month. Now, the Indian scholar says that it happens on the evening before the observance of Poshada. So if tomorrow is the Poshada ceremony, then in the evening, then all the bhikshus would gather together and do the Poshada and recite the Pratimoksha Sutra. This is what he says. But in our Tibetan scriptures of Vinaya, what it says about how one holds the Poshada ceremony. So if tomorrow is when we hold the Poshada ceremony, then the evening before, all of the bhikshus would have to gather together. And when they gather together, what they would do is they would have discussions about the Abhidharma. Now, I do have a doubt about what it means to say discussing the Abhidharma. So these days, when people talk about the Abhidharma these days, most people say that this is developed later, during the time of Nikaya Buddhism, during the time of the 18 different schools. So this is the way it's described generally these days. But when you talk about having discussions about Abhidharma, what people say that this discussion must be, that this is a discussion that came later. But it does say this in the Tibetan Vinaya scriptures. So it's been the entire night discussing the Abhidharma. So since the Poshada is held twice a month, and they'd had these Abhidharma discussions also were held twice monthly. So the evening before Poshada ceremony, it was very important to hold these Abhidharma discussions. And so in the morning when you hold the Poshadas, and in the first dawn session, now the first dawn session is in terms of today, it's probably around 2 in the morning. It's basically 2 a.m. So around 2 a.m., you would have the Poshada ceremony. So, as it said in our Sarvastivada stations, then if the Buddha was present, then the Buddha would come. If the Buddha is not present, then the senior or elder bhikshus would come, and they'd hold the Poshada ceremony. And all the bhikshus were doing the Poshada, then at that point, all the novices would have to stay outside. Well, the bhikshus would gather on their own, and what they'd do is they'd read the Pratimoksha Sutra, they'd recite it from memory. And so that was the practice. So it's the Pratimoksha Sutra, as we said, right? The Pratimoksha Sutra is primarily all the precepts, the 253 precepts of a bhikshu that are listed in the Pratimoksha Sutra. So the Pratimoksha Sutra is therefore like the basis of Vinaya discipline, and so you need to review it. You have to recite it from memory. This is what they did. So before the complete Pratimoksha developed, then there was what they recited. At that point, was there a Pratimoksha Sutra? There was not. And so basically the Pratimoksha Sutra, as the Buddha made each rule, then when the precepts became complete, then there was the Pratimoksha Sutra. At the beginning, there was no such Pratimoksha Sutra. So when the Sangha first developed, before there was the complete set of Vinaya rules, and what did they do during the Poshada rituals? At that time, they only had a little bit to recite, and what they recite was, do not commit any wrongs, perform abundant virtue, completely tame your own mind. This is the Buddha's teachings. So that's one. Then another is, restraint to the body is excellent. Restraint to speech is excellent too. Restraint to the mind is excellent. Restraint to all is excellent. A Buddha who is restrained in all is liberated from all suffering. That's another. Then they also say, guard your speech and restrain your mind. Do not perform non-virtues of the body. If you purify these three paths of action, you will gain the path the sage taught. So other than these three verses, there are only three verses. So and originally, when you practice Poshada, then this is all that was recited. Later, as the entire Patimokkha was compiled and the more rules were made, then the Patimokkha appeared. And then so later, for that reason, you began to reviews. And you had to recite it from memory. And the reason for doing this is that you have to recognize you have to remember what they are, what the precepts are. If otherwise you think of, oh, what is it? I have to look it up in text. That doesn't okay. During the time of the Buddha and during the time of original Buddhism, the Buddhist scriptures were not written down. So you had to memorize them and because tell them orally to each other and listen to them. And you have to learn them all orally. And so you had to memorize them. And so there's a benefit to this, because once you have memorized that, then you have it in your mind. You remember it. It's very clear in your mind. You don't have to carry a text with you. And you immediately remember what you're allowed to do. And it's not. You've got this all saved in your mind. Then after the sutra had been recited, then the novice would be invited in. They say, you should come in. And then what the novices would do, so every 15 days you hold the, every 15 days you'd hold the Poshada ceremony. And so then whatever offenses you'd done in the previous 15 days, you'd have to confess without hiding any to the Sangha. If you don't have any faults, if you think if you're pure, you have to explain how you're pure. And this is called offering purity, is what we call it. Say, I haven't had any events. And this is explaining your purity. And this is called the novice's Poshada. So the bhikkhus is reciting the Patimokkha Sutra, and the novices is offering purity. In any case, if the best you think is if it's going to be held at the first dawn session, and if not, it'd be at the second dawn session. The second was probably around 3:30 in the morning. So it's around 3:30 in the morning. And if you're unable to hold it at 3:30 in the morning, then when you have to hold it is in the last dawn session, which is around 5 in the morning. According to current calculations, it's around 5 a.m. So what's the reason why I had to get up so early in the morning and hold the Poshada ceremony? You might wonder why I would think it's just too early in the morning. Think, why do you have to get up so early and hold the Poshada ceremony then? There is a reason for it. And the reason is that you hold it early in the morning so that the householders won't come. If you do it during the daytime, then it's quite possible that there are going to be faithful public members of the public who will come to ask for teachers. They'd come to ask for Dharma teachings or come and make offerings. And so if you do it too early, then the lay people won't come. And the reason for this is that during the Poshada, you need to explain your offenses. I've done this. You have to. I did this offense within the Sangha. You see me saying, I've done this or I've done that. Now, so some householder comes from outside and hears them talking about all the offenses that they've done. Then the householder is going to think, oh, these pictures, they do all sorts of stuff. It's possible they might think like that when you're talking about the offenses, because there might be various. I think I've done this one or that one. They're different. The householders will come and they hear this. I think they're doing all this stuff. And it's possible that they'll lose their faith. And so there should be a private situation, an internal situation. You need to you need to confess it without hiding anything to the Sangha. But if the householders hear of it, then they're going to lose faith. And so you want to do it when the householders won't come. However, but there's a question and an exception to this. And the exception is that if there are people who are not going to lose faith when they hear them speak about their offenses, but instead feel even more faith, then it's possible for them to come to see the situation. The reason why this is, I think this is the time of whether it is during the time of King Bimbisara or the king or another king. The kings would sometimes want to come. And if the king was going to come, you have to let them come in. The king should be, but Nanda didn't let the king come in. And then at that point, what the king said is that normally, when they weren't allowed in, what the king says is we normally hide all of our faults every day. We hide all the faults we do our entire lives. And the bhikshus are explaining all this is explaining the offenses they've done in just a fortnight. And this is just amazing that they're doing. And so in their minds, they began to feel more faith. So if it's something that's going to increase the faith, then the faithful members of the public, if it's going to increase their faith, then it's allowed for them to come and see the Poshada ceremony. Otherwise, the Poshada is a ceremony that the members of the public should not come to. In any case, I have explained all this according to the Tibetan Mula Sarvastivada tradition. So I think that's probably enough for today. It's better to leave it here.